Okay, we are back in our study in Exodus chapter 12. We left off in verse 27, but I think it would be useful for us to do a quick review before we proceed. Um, First of all, I want to point out to you that when Moses went to speak to the children of Israel, he actually didn't speak to every single Israelite. He only spoke to the elders of Israel. So that's one point that I want us to pay attention to for now. And then Moses tells them to pick a lamb and then kill the Passover lamb on Passover day, which is on the 14th. Then he takes the blood that's in the basin using hyssop. And I tried to show you that hyssop is one of those what we would call lalang in our common day. Very common, and it will grow anywhere and everywhere. And they bunch it together and they can actually use it like a broom. And so they would strike the lintel, which is the top of the door, the two doorposts, which is at the side, with the blood. And it's very important that it's about the blood. And once the blood is smeared, none of them shall leave the house until morning. Because in the middle of the night, verse 23 tells us that the Lord himself, that's God himself, will cross the land to strike the Egyptians. But at the end of the day, it is important for the Israelites to know that when God does that and he is taking on the Egyptians, there is a requirement for them to put the blood. And if they don't have the blood on the door, then they will also die like the Egyptians. And so once God sees the blood on the door, then God will, it says here, pass over. I think the better word here is to skip over. The word itself is like, if you have broken a foot. And so when you walk, you're skipping, you're jumping. And that's the picture that the word gives us. And then God will not allow the destroyer. And by destroyer, it is with reference to an angel that will come and bring destruction. And what will that angel do is going to take the life of the firstborn. And by firstborn, you realize that it's men and animals. And so God says, you shall observe this thing as an ordinance. This is a rule, is a law for them, for you and your sons for a long, long time. And so when you come into the land which the Lord will give you, which is the promised land, just as he promised, you must keep this service. Meaning, the Passover must always be kept. So they must pick the lamb, kill the lamb, and remember what has done. And this is what I want us to remember, is that it shall be when your children ask you, what do you mean by this service? Why do we do this? Now remember, this is always done now as the first feast of the year. And so the children will say, hey, why, Daddy? Why do you do that? And so you shall say, it is a Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who skipped over the houses of the children of Israel when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our household. Now we come to this part. After the elders heard, the people bowed their heads. So bowing the heads and worship is actually the same thing, One is literally bowing, the other one is to bow down all the way. And the reason why they do that is when they hear that God is going to spare their lives. And that is in itself is it strikes them as, God is going to take care of these things, rescue them, deliver them, save them, prevent them from being killed, or their firstborn being killed. And so they recognize that this is their God. Verse 28, we continue. The children of Israel went away and did so, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, and so they did. And I want us to pay attention to these few words. 1, children of Israel. Right now, we're not talking about all the individuals. Remember when we first started in verse 21, right? And in verse 21, we are talking about the elders of the tribes of Israel. And so whenever you read the word children, do not assume that it is every single individual in Israel. And so when we read in verse 21, Moses spoke to the elders who represents their house and their tribe. And when they heard it, this is the second thing I want us to see. And so they did. Which means that everyone voluntarily went to do exactly what they were told for the month. So when the 10th of the month came, they have to pick a lamb or a goat, right? We read about that. It's not just a lamb. It's any of the four-footed small animals. And they did exactly they were told. And because they did exactly they were told, then they will be passed over or skipped over. Now we continue to verse 29. And it came to pass at midnight. I think the word midnight is more the middle of the night. And if the night is from sunset to sunrise, then technically the middle of the night will be midnight, our midnight even. Yeah. And that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt because they don't have the blood on the doorpost. From the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Now, this is an incredible night. And as the angel of destruction came, and because there was no blood on the doorpost, all the firstborn in Egypt died. And Pharaoh rose in the night, all his servants, all his captains, all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt. Now I want to point out to you that this word, a great cry, the word cry is a shriek. Shriek, R-I-E-K. And it's a very loud shriek. What does that mean is that if you just imagine that you suddenly find your firstborn child, firstborn son died, all of a sudden, that is the kind of shriek. Shriek will be better than cry. Cry is just saying something out loud. Shriek means at the top of your lungs, you how should you say, you make that sound that is a despair, right? It's a despair. It's a shock that all these firstborn is dying, and the animals die as well. So it is not just mere crying, it is an absolute shock, and Egypt was stunned. For there was not a house where there was no one dead, because there will always be somebody who is the firstborn. Now, one of the questions that people may ask is, as firstborn, are we talking about young children? Actually, this will be firstborn of young and old, right? Young and old. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel. Go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks, your herds, and be gone. But remember one thing, right? Bless me also." So he still thinks that now he has no choice. Because as his heart was hardened, remember, the heart was hardened. Hardened means that he was stubborn. Because he saw God slapping his face every instance until now that his firstborn son died, and then it's a tragedy across Egypt. He is the God of the land. He is also found himself losing his son. Now, even with a hardened heart, he had no choice. He has to surrender to God because this was the 10th strike. And in this 10th strike, it paralyzed the whole of Egypt because firstborn usually have roles to play. And all of these roles are crippled. Verse 33, the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste. Urge what people? In verse 33, he says that this people is, the word is right? And this refers to the Israelites. Send them out quickly. Why? Because the Egyptians has gone through 9 plagues, and the 10th being the worst of the plagues by far than all the 9 put together, and they cannot tolerate the Israelites anymore because the God of the Hebrews are with them. For they said, "We shall all be dead." Not just the firstborn. If they stay any longer, all of us will die. That's what's in the mind. And so the Israelites took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound out in their clothes over the shoulders. While they were kneading, it's still in the shoulders, no leave, which means that all the dough will not rise. And so it won't go back. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses. Everything Moses instructed them. These are the instructions. And they asked from the Egyptians silver, gold, and clothing. And guess what? Verse 36. Notice grace. The Lord had given the people grace in the eyes of the Egyptians. Remember, I always tell you, grace is always in the eyes of the beholder. What did the Egyptians see in the Israelites? They were so scared of the people because of what God has done. That is what it means. It is not because what the people have done, but because of what God has done. And they said, well, whatever you want, I give you. And so they give them what they asked, and thus they plundered the Egyptians. Now, this word plundered, it appears to be a reverse. The word here is to see. This is PL. Is to strip, right? Usually, what this word is used is when you are in a battle and you win the battle, you take everything from your opponent who has lost to you, and that is the word. And so the Israelites stripped the Egyptians of silver, gold, and clothing. And that would be called the spoils, right? But they weren't in a war. But in this entire battle between God and Pharaoh in the land of Egypt, well, God won in that sense. Verse 37. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses. Now, a lot of times, many people think, I also agree, that this is likely to be Goshen, another name for Goshen, to Sukkot. And this is what you need to pay attention to, because this is the beginning of the numbering of the children of Israel. 600,000 men on foot, besides children. And this 600,000 men on foot is an indication of a few things. This will indicate the men of battle, okay, or we call it the army. This will also indicate the men of inheritance, because inheritance is based on the men, not based on the women nor the children, right? So just remember that this is the idea that there were 600,000 men. But by men, this is not the usual word for men. This actually means, let me just put this away. 600,000 men on foot. And the word men here would be men of vigor, of valor. Means people who can fight, right? Besides children. And when it says people who can fight, it's also describing the nature of their job when they leave Egypt. Verse 38, a mixed multitude went up with them. Now this is interesting. Verse 38, the word mixture, right? A mixed multitude would be like what would be two different threads. So when you got clothing, mixed fiber, right? And so a mixed multitude actually means that these are people who are also not Israelites, who left with the Israelites, who went up with them also. That is what verse 38 actually means, a mixed multitude. And then the flocks, the herds, a great deal of livestock. They had unleavened cakes of dough. They brought out of Egypt, not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt and could not wait, and they had not prepared any provisions for themselves. Now, this is another interesting thing. God knew that they were leaving, and all they had done was to eat the dinner, right? The Passover Lamb, and some bitter herbs, and matzah, right? The unleavened bread. And they had their bowls of the dough, and they brought it along with them, and that's all they have. They didn't prepare provisions, because if they were in a long journey, they would have put together all kinds of food. Now, this is important is because it is to show them that God delivers them, God takes them out, and God will feed them. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt. Now, what do you mean by sojourn? In verse 40, the word here literally means the dwelling. The time they lived in Egypt, right? The time they dwelled in Egypt was 430 years. And that is the indication of the period of time. And after that, it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, on the very same day, that all the armies of the Lord went out from the land. So let me just break this down. 400 years is the time they had spent. Likely, a large part of this will be under persecution, right? Under oppression. And a large part of the 30 or more years, I would imagine likely to be more than 100 years, is when they first went into Egypt. And where do we see this? Will be the later chapters of Genesis, where there was a famine. Remember, 7 years of good, 7 years of famine. And in that period of the famine, middle of the famine, Jacob and the entire family moved into Egypt and stayed there. So all in all would be about 400 odd years, right? About 400 odd years. But then the next word that I wanted to point out to you is this word, armies. Savaot. You heard of the phrase Jehovah Savaot, Jehovah Savaot. And so Jehovah Savaot, the Lord of hosts, is usually the name given to God as the general of his army of angels. And his angels will fight on behalf of God. But in this case, when the children of Israel left, right? The children of Israel left Egypt. They were called men on foot. And these were the men who can fight, and hence the army of God. Because now the war, as we go on into the wilderness, all the battles is not going to be done by the angels, but by the Israelites. And so the Israelites are now called the armies of God. And the Lord will be Jehovah Tsevaot. That is what it means. And it is a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is the deliverance. And if you like the word, salvation. So in the minds of the Israelites, salvation and deliverance is very concrete. It is not about talking about saving while you're in Egypt. It is really about living and experiencing how God did all the miracles and led them out of Egypt by destroying the firstborn of the Egyptians. And then when they came out and they plundered Egypt, the Egyptian, and they can actually experience the salvation. And so this is how they will always remember every time they come back to the first month of the year, which is the month of Nisan. They will observe the Passover, and that is the night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations, through the generation and generation after them. And that in itself is important because, how should I say, this this is how they will always remember God. So when they remember God, it is about talking about this event. It is about remembering this event. It's about having the lamb sacrifice to God and eating the lamb. And so all of these are the motions that they will reflect. And they are doing it every year and every generation, so that when the children participate in it, the children grow up, and so they would do it with their children's children. And hence, that is how the Passover is perpetuated. So when you have the chance to read, say, the four Gospels, right, you would see the highlight feast is the Passover. That would be the anchor for the four Gospels. Now, this is our last segment. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, and this is the conditions. This is the rule of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat it. Remember, there were a lot of people that went with them. Remember the mixed multitude, non-Israelites. So let me point out to you this word here in verse 43. It says, no foreigner. By foreigner, it is an alien, right? It is an alien. And this would be, by definition, non-Israel. Not part of the 12 tribes of Israel. That would be an easy way of understanding. It says, but every man's servant who is bought for money, when you have circumcised him, he may eat it. And so the condition is this: by right, foreigner cannot eat. But some of these Israelites have actually slaves, right? Who are male, who are not Israelites. And so the condition is circumcision. That they participate in the circumcision. And so by a symbol, they now join the Israelites. Then he may eat it. Verse 45. Now 45 uses a different word, a sojourner. A sojourner would be just now the mixed multitude who came out, but they are not slaves, right? Here, 44 is talking about a non-Israelite slave. But if this was a visitor, a guy who joins the Israelites, say, hey, your God is good. He can beat the gods of Egypt, and my Pharaoh now cannot tahan, so I join you. So this is that non-Israelite, but he's not a slave. And this non-Israelite also have a hired servant. They shall not eat it. Why? Because they are not part of the family of Israel. With a servant, and you must understand the culture, right? This is a bond servant. Means who has been bought. And by all intents and purposes, he belongs to the Israelite. And since he belongs to the Israelite, is part of the household, then God wants him to be circumcised to be part of that household in a more permanent way. Verse 46, in one house it shall be eaten, you shall not carry any of the flesh outside, means you cannot tap out and go in the night and leave. Nor shall you break one of its bones. You shall actually roast or burn the lamb as a whole. And all the congregation of Israel shall keep it. And when a stranger dwells with you and wants to keep the Passover. Now, what is there? The condition is, let all his males be circumcised. And only after that, let him come near and keep it. And then he now will live as a native of the land. What does this mean? If this stranger, verse 48, and this is the word ger. And this is a particular word which is also a non-Israelite. So let me just put it down. A non-Israelite. And this non-Israelite is amongst them, lives with them, and he says, hey, you keep the Passover, I also want to join you. And so God says, can circumcise first. Only then, he now, after the circumcision, he is now like the bond servant here. Right? That he is now part of the Israelites because the circumcision is a symbol of, well, short of a better word, the symbol of membership, right? Now you're considered native of the land as, and what does this mean? Native means one born of the land, and so you are like one of them, right? You may not be a true Israelite, being born in one of the tribes, but by this act of circumcision that you are willing to join and worship and serve this God of Israel, then by that circumcision, you are now part and parcel of the family of Israel. But no tribe. You are just like one of them, but no tribe. Which means what? Which means that when you come into the promised land, they do not have a share of the land because they're not part of the tribe, 12 tribes. And God says, no uncircumcised person shall eat it. And so for all intents and purposes, what you can see from verse 43 to 48 is, in different cases, as long as the people who wants to eat it is circumcised, it really doesn't matter whether you are a bond servant, you are a non-Israelite living amongst them, an Egyptian, right? Or a stranger from elsewhere. Doesn't matter. You circumcise, all can do. Why? And this is important. One law shall be for the native born and the stranger who dwells among you. One law. God doesn't make, so there is basically no exceptions. To the Israelites, they are already circumcised. But for the stranger and those who are native born, they have to be circumcised. The Israelite and the non-Israelite. It is basically to tell us that this is the character of God. God is a fair God. So he doesn't say, oh, Israelite, I give you one rule. The non-Israelite, then we can have some exemptions. Once you are part and parcel of this ecosystem called the God's people in this nation of Israel, that all must do the same. That's what it means. Verse 50, thus all the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. This is so important because they fear God, they do exactly as they were told. And so it came to pass on that very same day, the Lord brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt according to their armies. What armies? People to serve God. Because the word armies always lets us think that they're going to fight. I think the easier way not to think of it as army, but people to serve God. And if God wants them to fight, they fight. And so we call them army. If God wants them to make offering, they are worshippers. If God wants them to make the tabernacle, then they do exactly as they are told. So the word is better to say that they are people to serve God. They are of service to God. See, angels are of service to God. So angels cannot say, no, I don't want to listen to God at this time. They are made to listen to God. But the children of Israel have to willingly obey God. And if they do that, then they are called armies of God, in the sense that they will listen and do what God tells them. So when they're out in the wilderness and they are attacked by other people, God organizes them, and Moses becomes literally a general to lead them into battle. And then later on, of course, you find Joshua taking over in the book of Joshua. And so the Israelites play multiple roles by this word. And so the singular word that probably reference best is to serve or of service. Meaning when God says jump, and the people shall say how high. It cannot be why, right? It has to be how high. What do you want me to do? And that should also remind us, when we reflected upon ourselves, that the entire chapter 12 of Exodus really gives us a very important lesson. One, the Passover, that we understand what it is and why it is so important to the Israelites up till today. And you also know why it is the most important feast in the four Gospels. When you look through the narrative of the history and the life of Jesus, of John the Baptist, of the apostles, and is always anchored by time based on the Passover. And so the Passover is what they always remember, because the Passover in the New Testament narratives also indicate the beginning of the year. So that you know that the Passover is sometime March, early April, right? That is their beginning of the year. And that would be the religious year. And why is it the beginning of the year? Because right in chapter 12, verse 1, God says, we're going to change the calendar. Today, this month will be the first of your month. So that whenever you have the new year, you remember God's deliverance. You remember the power of God. You remember the life that God has given you. You remember that God has heard you. You remember that God has taken you out of Egypt. You remember that you are the people to serve God. So all these things is in this chapter. And so whenever we remember ourselves before God, unfortunately, we don't remember who God is and what God has done. We always remember what we asked God to do. And that is the biggest difference between us and the Israelites. We are structured, I guess, in our society and our culture, that we only remember what God has given us. We ask Him, we are in trouble. But the Israelites is enforced as a law. Remember, this is the ordinance. And as an ordinance, they cannot not do it. Like ordinance is like, no, you are supposed to stop at the red light. It is not an option. It is not an option. Now, of course, today we will say, no car, then we will do it, we will cross. But as an ordinance to God, God wants them to make sure that they follow. Now, of course, there are many Jews who don't follow the Passover. Why? Because they don't care. And if they don't care, then they have to bear the consequence. You break the ordinance, you pay the consequence. So if we don't care about the red light and we cross the red light and we get into an accident, we pay for the consequence. And so the whole idea of this Passover is to remember that God spared their lives by the angel of destruction, through the blood that is smeared on the door. The second thing is they remember God delivering them out of Egypt. That Pharaoh and the Egyptians willingly tell them, please go. That is important because God has forced their hand and they surrendered. And that is to show them who God really is. So the Passover is about God. It is not about the lamb, right? All of these are the rituals. And all the instructions given to the Israelites has only one purpose. Will you listen to me? And so they did. That is the relationship that God is teaching the Israelites. I tell you, you do. Don't ask why. So you are people to serve me, and when I say jump, you ask how high. And hence that would be the kind of a relationship as is being developed when they exit Egypt to go into the wilderness. And then God will be their God so that they will listen to what God has to say. But remember, through Moses. And then their job is, what do we do now? What do you want me to do? And that's how that whole relationship is now starting to build up. Now remember, before this time of Exodus leaving Egypt, they never had this chance to serve God. They remember everything that was told to them by Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who God is. But there was no ritual, nothing. Nothing. The rituals only started now in Exodus chapter 12. And later on, we'll talk about all the other feasts. So for the longest time, for 430 years in Egypt, they only knew about God. They were different because God has brought them there to preserve them. So let me give you one last point before we end. Why were the Israelites in Egypt? And that has a very, very important point. Number one, had they been in Canaan all these years, in all likelihood, there will be no more Israel. Because all the people around them, the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Kenizzites, the Philistines, everybody would be after their back, and they would have died as a family of Jacob before too long. And so this whole thing was engineered by God that because of that great famine, they moved into Egypt and had the favor of Pharaoh because of Joseph. Remember, when we ended in Genesis, Joseph said, what you had designed or planned to be bad for me, well, it turned out pretty well. And God used the incidents to protect Israel. But remember, when they went into Egypt, the entire family, including Joseph, were only 70 people. 70 people is just a family. Now, remember the number that we saw? 600,000 male, right? If you add women, children, then you should get easily past 1 million people. And that was the reason why Israel needed to be under the protection of Pharaoh so that they can grow to a nation. And so when they leave Egypt, they went into Egypt as a family, they left Egypt as a nation. So they don't have to worry about fighting. Pharaoh would take care of it because Pharaoh would defend them because they are in Goshen. They are in Pharaoh's land. Now when they leave Egypt, they are now a formidable force. Right? Now, next week when we look at chapter 13, they are formidable only in number. They are not formidable in experience. Although God will say, hey, go and fight, they can't fight the biggest and strongest enemy. So God will have to divert their traffic so that the people they meet is not so strong that they can never ever thought of overcoming them. And so we will leave that for next week. And with this, we end chapter 12. Any questions?
Pastor, when they say the men, especially men that is not including the very young and the very old.
Let me just show you. Just now, when we were talking about the 600,000 men right here, 600,000 men on foot. The word men here are men of valor, people who can fight. And generally, when they say people who can fight, the Bible will describe them as people or men who is above 20.
And below?
Below, they're all called children. Below, they're all called children.
But,
well, we don't call them children, but the Bible refers to them as children.
But I mean that there will be men who are maybe in their 90s.
The old men
will not be counted, right?
Well, the old man is not part here, and it's not described here. So two types of people who are not described here are the men who are older than, I think, 60. Older than 60. The women are two categories that are not described. And so children would be under 20. And so these would be just the men who can fight in that sense. All right?
And what about the mixed multitudes? Who will be the mix?
Okay, the question is on verse 38. Mixed multitude. The mixed multitude are people who are non-Israelite.
Could be.
Non-Israelite, and since they are all in Egypt, I would imagine they are Egyptians.
Those
right?
who prefer to follow this God.
The Egyptians who prefer to follow, and after they've seen what God has done, that they believe that they are better off and safer with the Israelites because the God of the Hebrews is powerful.
So it could be these people who, in the end, when they are in the wilderness,
they wanted to eat meat. Yep, possible. Yeah. There's another question here. It says, what the flock, the food for Israelites, milk and meat? Yes and no. Okay, yes and no. The Bible never actually described how should I describe the fact that the meat was eaten. But I presume so. Right? I presume so. And if they had large number of flock, the question would be whether there was enough to go around, because they were in a very mobile environment and was constantly moving around, whether there was enough to eat. So I would think that when we get into the later parts of Numbers, right? We talk about Numbers, when they complained that there was not enough to eat, I don't think that they had nothing to eat. I think they were choosy what they want to eat. That would be more likely to be the case. And so they had manna and they had all the rest. And it means this. Remember, manna is not meat. Manna is actually vegetable. And they don't have vegetable because they are not in agriculture yet, because they're moving around. So yes, milk and meat would be something that they could have been having in the course of the journey. How is Passover celebrated today? Interesting question. As of today, when we talk about today, 2021, anytime there's after 70 AD, things have changed when there was no more temple. As a rule, based on my understanding, that when they had take the lamb, they are supposed to kill the lamb in the temple. They cannot kill the lamb anywhere they choose. Now that they don't have a temple, they don't do that anymore because it's not possible. So the Passover after 70 AD is only a remembrance, purely a remembrance. I mean, the Passover was always remembrance, but they don't have the meat part. They still have the unleavened bread part, right? The unleavened bread part. Now I know that there's been a lot of people trying to show that there are 4 cups and all these things. All of these are modern. They are not from the Bible. And so over time, the Passover remembrance have been embellished, especially when they were in Babylon and after Babylon. And then after the temple was destroyed, in the modern times, they have introduced new elements of remembrance, like the first cup, the second cup, the third cup, and the fourth cup kind of thing. I would see that this is all modern, and there's no scriptural reference, so I can't piece that together. But it's a more modern remembrance, yes. Now I remember last year or year before last, they tried to slaughter a lamb at near the Temple Mount. All of these are crazy people. Until there is a temple, lamb has no meaning. You might as well go and barbecue your own lamb. Okay.
So what about verse 46? Not to break the bones.
Verse 46, not to break the bones. To eat it as whole, basically. Not to eat it, to cook it as whole. Verse 46. You shall not break the bones, and you shall not carry the flesh out. And so the idea here is to eat it as whole, as one family, and really take the meat straight from the cooked lamb.
It means not in pieces.
Not in pieces.
As a whole.
You have to roast the lamb as a whole. Like how many people roast lamb today? Otherwise, you'll be having lamb chops and not a roast lamb. So this, in effect, tells us that it's a whole lamb, a whole goat. And when you can't finish it, you burn it. That's it now. Okay? All right. I'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.